Welcome back to another episode of the Rethinking Porn Addiction Show. We're happy to have you here. My name is Nate. Once again, back here with Hans and Jake. We are your average Joes who are talking about our experiences with porn and today shame. And then down below, we have our residential clinicians. We've got Kristen Hodson and Doug Braun Harvey. Wonderful to have you both here with us. For context, Jake and Kristen are married. Kristen and Hans is married to Kristen's best friend. There's all this weird intermingling of amazing relationships, and Kristen and Doug have been colleagues for quite some time, professional colleagues. But this is like your first time working on a project together, right?
Yeah.
So we have all these like fun relationships that kind of go into this cast of characters, and it's a fun and interesting dynamic. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And this is our 13th conversation, so if you are just jumping in, know that you can go backwards in time and listen to some amazing conversations and get a lot more context out of this. There might be some stuff that we talk about that, especially since this is kind of a progression from the last conversation we had. It might be worth your while to listen to that one either right after you listen to this one, so you have a little bit of context, or even to go back and listen to that one before you listen to this one. But I'm really excited to talk today. Last conversation we had, we talked about sexual shame. We talked about what it is, how crippling it is, how it contributes to pornography problems, how it can literally like make issues worse and cause problems inside your relationship and with your sexual relationship with yourself. And overall, the conversation was like really transparent, but it wasn't very light. Like it felt like we went into the tunnel, but we didn't come out the other side. And I think the tunnel it was important to go into, but today I think the conversation that we're going to have is going to be kind of how you get out of that tunnel of shame. And I'm really excited to have a conversation about that. As we were prepping for this conversation, the analogy that we wanted to kind of build the conversation around comes from Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are. Kristen, do you want to share a little bit about the garden analogy and kind of how that maybe set the stage for that?
Yeah, and I also invite you, let's co-do this because you express it very well as well.
We'll collaborate. I just don't want to dominate the conversation, and I feel like you introduced me to Emily's work.
Sure.
And anyway, so hashtag Emily Nagoski, shout out.
Emily Nagoski talks about how when we come into this world, we're basically given this plot of land. And if we're looking at it through the lens of sexual development, in this plot of land, we have a lot of seeds or ideas or messages that are planted into this garden. And some are nurtured more, some grow and overtake the garden. Some seeds are really helpful and good, and others become the weeds of the garden and kind of overtake. And what happens is our parents, our community, our media, they're the ones kind of planting seeds into our garden of sexual development.
Yeah.
And we hit a point where we've got to evaluate what's in our garden. What do we want to keep in there, and what do we want to pull out? What do we want to trim down? What do we need to plant that wasn't in there? And so when we're looking at this and we're piggybacking on shame from the last week, is starting to evaluate the roots of shame and how much they are in our garden. How dominant are they? And that's kind of the metaphor so that we can look that, we talked a little bit too about some of these seeds aren't planted intentionally. They can be there's a lot of good intention. Parents and other figures doing the best they can with what they were given. And so, but they still aren't, those messages aren't serving us anymore.
So I want to get more specific here. So you perfectly set up the analogy as like a generalization here. And I just want to get a little bit more specific on what types of things are being planted, maybe from our own personal experiences.
Yep.
So, whoever wants to share can share, but I just want to give our audience an idea of like what it's looked like to have somebody else plant things in your garden, things that serve you, and then also things that don't serve you. So I think the most common one that I don't think anybody would disagree with this is that the media plants, like the movies you watch, the TV shows you watch, the books you read, the magazines you see on the rack at the grocery store, like all of those things plant ideas of what sex should look like, or how sex should be, how your, as Doug says, how your sexual debut should happen, or the time you lose your virginity, and how your body should look, how you should sound during sex. Those are all things through the media, and I know that I picked up growing up, that kind of got planted in my garden without me saying, yeah, please plant this.
Can I add something to that, Nate? I think there's a deeper source of shame that you just talked about, why we go to media. And I think we go to media and rely on media because our culture has abdicated providing adequate sex education or very biased sex education. So people end up looking to the media for things the media is never designed for. The media is not a sex educator, but that's where people go because we as a culture fail to give people good information. And it's the failure of having good information that leads to so much shame.
I love that, Doug, because I think people, and kids especially, in their curious state of being, want to make sense of their bodies. They want to understand what is happening to them. And if the adults in their lives aren't having that conversation, then they go to sources that are, even if it is inaccurate or biased, or at least
or profit driven.
That's right. I really appreciate that.
What other as you guys think about your past, what were some other sources of sexual seeds that got planted in your garden before you even knew you had a garden?
That's a great question. I like how you phrased it, Nate, because I think a lot about my kids right now, who are 11 and 9 and 5. And I think about the innocence that they have, or the lack of shame. It's just genuine curiosity and genuine learning and growth that they're going through. And I am very conscious about trying not to implant into them or impress upon them my own personal items that I have in my garden of shame.
Name one. What's one thing you don't want in their garden that's very clearly in yours?
Yeah. For a long time, and this gets at your question, Nate, also, I think primarily probably because of my family of origin and upbringing in a fairly conservative home, and the religion that I'm in and have been in that we've talked about. I, for a long time, did not feel that it was okay that I had sexual urge or sexual desire at all. That was just not an acceptable thing to experience. And whenever I felt that or experienced that, I was either doing something wrong, or I was crossing a line, or in some way I was violating something just by having sexual desire or sexual impulse, or anything related to that kind of emotion. And that was a big one for me. And I don't want my kids to feel that. I want them to understand, I think, what I've come to later in life, that we are innately built, and we have a large component of our being that is sex and sexual. And I want them to know from the beginning that that's a great part, a beautiful part of their being and their body.
Being in a room with 4 penis owners, sorry to phrase it in that way, but I'm curious, because an early reminder of the garden is an erection. You bring up arousal and desire, but bodies responding just as they do, because that's what penises do. And it just can be spontaneous. I think of little children, like early. Was there any meaning made of that experience? Was there helping you understand what your body was doing? Was there silence? Was there moving your hands away? Like, did anything occur there?
For me personally, not at home. The input that I did get was primarily from church about whether or not that was acceptable or okay. But at home, it just wasn't talked about. It was just it was I don't know, it was taboo, but it was a silent subject at home. So maybe my few hours of education at school, whenever that was, I don't know, growing up at some point. And then church really was a place that I formed my own. I really just took the information that I had around me and formed my own idea of of being aroused and having an erection, and well, that's not okay. I'm not married, so I shouldn't be having erections yet. So something's not right here.
Going back to that garden analogy, I think for me, we talked about how if we don't seek out, information from a good source, we then go to the media, right? And it was kind of the way it was sort of mentioned was like we were seeking it out, right? That you're actually doing this. And I would think back to my childhood and those of my children, and it's less intentional than that. I think children in particular are really input based. They're just gathering it all in, and then processing comes later on down the road. I'm not a psychologist, but that's what I've experienced in my own children. And I think for me, one of the things that I've come up with as I've been thinking about this garden analogy is how unintentional my garden was planted. It was very much seeds were just thrown, and then what stuck. And so the thing that, kind of following on Doug's question, the thing I hope to do with my children is to, and with the help of Chrissy, obviously, I think we've been very intentional about what seeds are put in our kids' gardens. And then we'll obviously empower them to sort of make their own choices and tend to that garden as they get older. But for me, it was a very uncomfortable subject to talk about from my parents to me. And I think as a result of that, it became my sort of sexual education became very haphazard as a result of that. And my parents were probably along the lines of, oh, he'll learn about this when it's an appropriate time, meaning probably pre-marriage, or he'll learn about it from the appropriate sources, being ecclesial leadership, right? Church-based leadership, which going back to that garden again is you can't then control what seeds are throwing in there, let alone what seeds will stick and where and how they stick.
Yeah.
So that to me has been the biggest realization from a generational shift is I know my kids are going to get messages from the media. Like that just will happen.
Yeah.
So we've had to become very proactive early to try to be like, yeah, there's that. And these other things. And then, you talked about sort of this, erections coming around. I remember when our oldest was super young and he got his erections, and it was kind of like, okay, well, that's just the body being normal, just under normal stimulus and excitement, completely physiological. And I thought about, we have a 6-year-old now who loves to be tickled, but like caressed, right? Like she'll wake up in the morning and she's like, tickle me right here. And then she goes, oh, that feels good. And she makes this like face, and she's super expressive. And that to me was where it was sort of a big aha moment where I had of, there is nothing innately sexual about this. It's pure pursuit of pleasure. And that later on, and usually it's by, a parental source or an adult source, the sexual nature gets attached to it and then stigmatized or made taboo. And so for me, it's been very nice to see my 6-year-old daughter who's, super innocent, just kind of be like, oh, that feels good. And to see that and be like, yeah, it does. What about this? And just to see that call and response type of thing that occurs so early on.
So I heard two things in your discussion. One was this possibility of biased sex education. It's not just absence of sex education, but when there's a reliance on only one resource or authority, it can be very biased. And that's sort of, Hans, what you were describing.
Yeah.
Get it all over here, and there's only one perspective.
Right.
Right. And then, Jake, I hear you describing sort of when the body is allowed to have its experiences that it wants to have without judgment, and without somebody exploiting or taking advantage of sort of those natural things the body wants. That's a garden of not having shame about one's body later on. But too often, even those examples of what you were describing, people become so terrified of something non-consensual happening that they won't engage in that kind of contact. They'll avoid it. They'll be frightened of it. And the avoidance of the touch, the fear on the look of someone's face, like, oh, I better not do that, that can communicate shame. Oh my God, what you want is dangerous. What you want is frightening your parent. And the child doesn't know why. So I just really want to honor that space you describe so beautifully that a parent and a child can have, that is planting seeds of the pleasure and enjoyment of one's body rather than shame and fear of what one's body feels.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm starting to have memories of like moments in my life where seeds were planted, and I'm looking back and going like, wow, that was a seed that I don't want in my garden that is now like, that was there for a very long time without me even realizing it. Do you mind if I share like one or two?
Yeah, no, I'm curious.
So like one was, I remember when I was probably about 11, I woke up one morning and my mom kind of pulled me aside and said, hey, your dad and I came to tuck you in last night and you had your hand in your pants, like in your underwear. And we noticed that, and we just wanted to let you know, like, we don't do that. Like you shouldn't touch yourself like that. It was like a really uncomfortable conversation. I don't remember exactly what she said. All I remember is going like, oh, trying to like wanting to disappear through the floor. And
that's shame, by the way.
Yeah. That's shame.
That's how the body.
And the message I got was, you're not allowed to touch yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Like you cannot touch certain areas of your body and you're not allowed to give yourself pleasure. And then when I was in like 8th grade, I remember. Oh, go ahead, Jake.
Was that messaging given to you at the same time, or was it implied?
I don't remember 100%. I think I don't know if it was like just like really overtly, you don't like, this is bad. Well, it was pretty clear.
Okay.
That's not what we do, you know?
Maybe what's important here is that was Nate's takeaway.
Yes.
Regardless of what message was delivered, here he is all these years later saying, I remember that message.
Yep.
I remember as a teenager in 8th grade, I was like super awkward, gangly, like more awkward than I am now, which is saying something. And I did not have any social skills. I was like the oldest. I didn't have any older siblings to kind of show me the ropes. And a girl in my neighborhood took an interest in me. And we went to a middle school dance, and she hugged me at the dance. And it was the first time I hugged a girl, and I danced with her. It was the first time I danced with a girl. And then on the way home, she held my hand. And I remember like my body responded. Like it was out of this world, fun and exciting and electric. And I was like, holy cow, whoa, girls are amazing. And I got home, and my mom pulled me aside and said, do you want to tell me something? And I said, no. They're like, what are you talking about? And she's like, if you want to tell me something, now's a great chance. And I was like, what are you talking about? And she's like, do you have a girlfriend? And I was like, no. And she brought up the girl's name and said, you know, I heard that you were holding her hand, and you know that we don't date people exclusively until, you know, you're much older. Like you can't even go on dates until you're 16. And then even then you're not supposed to steady date. You're not supposed to pair off with somebody. And she's like, you know, and I like, once again, remember sinking through the floor and just being like, oh, I did something terrible. And I felt that experience followed me through my life. I didn't have the courage to kiss a girl until I graduated high school. I had many opportunities. Like I took lots of girls to dances. I had lots of crushes all through middle school and high school. And I was so scared that if I kissed somebody and we paired off and became exclusive, that I would have to have another conversation with my parents about my improper behavior and that other people would look down on me. And so I know, like, anyway, that I still like, I can feel it in my body. Like I feel the tension in my chest and in my shoulders, remembering those moments. And just like remembering like how gross I felt, how bad I felt that I had broken the rule, that I had strayed outside what kind of was our family rules or our religious rules. And those were seeds that were planted in my garden that just made me want to kind of shrivel up and die.
You know, what's interesting I hear you talk is you talk about like breaking the family rules, but I haven't heard yet sitting down and really understanding like the proactive conversations. It sounds like you had conversations after you had in your family culture messed up. And then you got the conversation of, we don't do that. But there wasn't like proactive conversations of, here's how our family navigates, and this is what we do. And based on our beliefs, it's X, Y, or Z. It's really ambiguous expectations that you weren't brought into until after. And then you're like, oh my, I screwed up. And that ambiguity can foster the shame because you're the problem.
Yeah, and I even probably knew the expectations, to be honest with you, but what I didn't know is how to deal with things as they came up. Like, we never had a conversation about, hey, what if a girl holds your hand? Or what if a girl, you know, what if you dance with a girl and you find yourself attracted to her? Like, what's an appropriate response? Or, you know, if you are in high school and you have a crush on a girl and she has a crush on you, how do you handle that romantic tension that you want to be together and you want to, like, what are the boundaries you set? How do you set boundaries? What's consent? Like, we never had any of these conversations. And because of that, like, I know I also hurt a lot of young ladies that I went to high school with because I like would get their hopes up, or we'd go out and have a really fun time together. And it was obvious that we had like crushes on each other. And then I'd freeze up so badly that I would, what's known as today as ghosting. I would completely just cut off contact. I would just disappear. And I was actually going through, oh, this is so weird. I was going through a box of old letters from high school a couple of months ago. And I found a letter from this girl telling me, she called me a bastard in the letter, and it was really cute because she spelled it wrong. But she was telling me about how much fun she had on this date that I had asked her on, and we had a blast together. And, you know, I probably held her hand and we probably danced really close, and she probably felt like this really great chemistry. And then I just stopped, like, talking to her. I'd avoid her in the halls. And she wrote me this letter saying like how much she liked me and how much fun we were having, and then how I just like disappeared and how much it hurt and how I was a bastard for my behavior. And then once again, like, even reading that note, it brought all of those emotions back. And I'm like, you know?
So I want a couple of things you said, Nate. First of all, the one you're reminding all of us right now as you tell your story, the body remembers all of this.
Yeah.
So you know, you can feel in your body right now. That's right. That's how powerful shame is. It's not a moment that we feel it in our body. It's something we store in our body.
Yeah.
And we can feel it like a battery releasing energy just because the switch has been turned on 5 years later and it still works, because the battery's there. And so that I just want to say this is the way it works. So if men listening have this kind of experience, the fact that you're feeling it so intensely when you revisit the event, that's the way it works. That's not a sign of anything being wrong. That's how much energy has been stored in the body.
And one last one that I thought of that I hope all of you guys, all of the penis owners and holders can relate to is like, this is more a question, but I know I experienced this. Did you at any point in your life ever realize that, or come to the realization that the size of your penis, quote unquote, mattered? Like, maybe you're changing your clothes in middle school or high school in gym class, and you hear guys talking, and then you become self-conscious about, like, is it big enough? Is it small enough? Do I have enough hair? Like, there's that kind of that puberty time where like, you don't have any control over it, but there's judgments around it, and you don't know where you like rank compared to other people. And anyway, I remember that.
You're talking about body shame in a particular part of the body, but there can be shame about lots of parts of one's body. But, for men in particular, their penis can be a focal point for sources of shame.
Yeah.
I could tell, like, I'm worked up talking about this stuff. I'm gonna step back now that I've shared some of my seeds.
Right.
But
now let's just check. What's it like to just hear the other men in the group tell their stories as you're listening to the other men, because these are not stories men often have with each other. So what's it like to listen to each other say these things? What are you noticing about yourselves as you're listening to each other?
I noticed for sure what you said about energy and emotion being stored. Because as Nate was telling stories, I was like, oh yeah, I felt that. I still feel that. Like they were very much a visceral part of my growing up, and they are very much a visceral part of what I feel now when I relive those moments, or when I heard Nate talk about them. Mm-hmm. So that rings true to me. And I think maybe thinking about our current topic of conversation, there's a lot. It seems like a steep uphill climb to overcome that shame feeling that Nate talked about, and that I felt, and I imagine Jake felt as a little kid. And to try and unpack that and unwind that now at this age is kind of a daunting task.
Yeah.
I want to set a goal for sexual shame. It's not because what you kind of described is a bit part of a kind of a masculine male script of something. We conquer it, we overcome it,
Sure.
all that kind of stuff. That idea is not helpful with shame.
Yeah.
What's more useful with shame is we go through it. We just go through it. So I like to think of it as a path, maybe like of hot coals, or there's something kind of frightening to go through, and then we get to the other side, and then we realize I did that, I got through it, and then you have a skill that can take you through the rest of your life, because shame is part of living. And so it's not like this idea that it's going to be something that's behind us and we don't have to deal with it anymore. It's absolutely not real. Shame is just a skill. Processing shame is a skill. Oh, I know how to do that. It's going to feel awful for a little bit, and then I'm going to be fine. That's the goal with working with shame.
Doug, you prompted something that this may be an unpopular opinion, but I think as a therapist, even like, let's work through and heal shame, or as we're raising our children, let's prevent them from feeling in shame. And I'm like, you know what? That's not the goal for me anymore, because shame is a part of living. It is a part of life. And so if you can start to recognize, I think the hardest part with shame is not differentiating from it. But when you can differentiate it and see it for what it is, of like, oh, this is shame instead of this is me, you can start to move through it differently and form a different relationship with it.
So can I give an example of Nate's story? I want to apply something Nate shared, Christy, to what you just said.
Yes, do.
Nate described coming home from the date or the dance, this really fun time, right? Nate had a really great time. That was Nate's experience.
Yes.
Right? Nate did not feel shame holding the hand when he was enjoying this lovely experience. Nate wasn't feeling shame as they're dancing and having fun. Nate felt shame when he was shamed, not for what he did.
Mm-hmm.
There was definitely some panic when it was all happening.
Okay. That's anxiety. That's fear. Got it.
Right.
That's different.
Right. But you're right. Like the shame comes from a judgment.
Yes, that's right. You were not flooded with shame as you were enjoying dancing with an 8th grade girl.
Right.
That's interesting, because someone just brought up sort of this prevention thing, right? Like preventing. And I think I was raised in a time where prevention was a very big focal point. We don't date till we're 16 because we want to prevent opportunities. We don't have serious relationships until you're much older because we want to prevent the possibility of something occurring. And so I was just wondering, is there a way to sort of approach sexuality or sexual health from a prevention-based standpoint that wouldn't sort of inherently foster shame?
Well, I think Nate described what was absent. He said, nobody helped me do this. And he went through this wonderful list of how to deal with this when this happens, how to deal with this when this happens. Those are the conversations that don't happen. One of the things I like to say about the lives of men and their sexual lives, shared values. That's right. Sharing values as a proactive conversation. But all these stories you've told us is that we're typically only interested in the lives of boys, the sexual lives of boys or the sexual lives of men, until we're not interested in them until they do something wrong.
Yes.
You know, all of these stories you're describing, you know, there wasn't a conversation to guide you in anticipation of this happening.
Yeah.
That's when you were talking, Nate, about your story of even like circling back to this is rethinking porn addiction, of having an adult be like, you're gonna encounter, it's not if, but you're gonna encounter sexual imagery or pornography, and you may have a wide range of emotions, and it's going to be normal to be curious, and you may stumble on it accidentally, and being able to guide them through so that it's, I think about kids trying to navigate and make sense of these really complex situations, and they're confronted with normal curiosity, but then the other thing with shame is it's not just the overt messages, it's the absence of messages as well, that it's so harmful we can't even talk about this, which is bad. And so I think about even if there could have been guidance around pornography, instead of like, a lot of boys or men, their first conversation is, we caught you.
Right.
And that was wrong.
Or you better not get caught.
Opportunity to be like, to explore Doug will say, I think you use this language, Doug, but the upside, the part that's like the pleasure, it's just like, that's bad. Let's
what you enjoy about it.
Yeah.
So before we continue down this path, I want to loop back to the analogy that we started with, because I feel like we're starting to move to the second part. So at the very beginning of this conversation, we kind of shared, Hans, Jake, and I shared some of the seeds that were planted in our sexual garden without our permission. And there comes a point in life, and maybe for those of you who are watching right now, maybe right now is that point where you realize you have a sexual garden, and you realize that what's planted there is your responsibility. And so you have to go revisit that garden and examine what's been planted there. What are all the things that I believe and feel and have experienced around sex? And which of those things are useful? And which of those things do I want to get rid of? What do I want to keep? What do I want to get out? And then what do I want to plant in there in its place?
Yes.
And this is the part where like we start to take responsibility. And this is what we're talking about, like learning to deal with shame, learning to talk, like change generational patterns of shame and honesty and anxiety around talking about sex and pleasure and sexuality. And I would love to spend the rest of this conversation kind of walking people through how do we examine our gardens and maybe look for the weeds and pull them out in a healthy way, both individually and maybe in partnership with each other as well, if you're in a partnership.
Can I just add a little bit of sexual science here for this question, Nate? Because I want to translate your question into actually something sexual scientists have been very interested in looking at only in the last couple of years. They've identified 5 shame weeds in men's gardens.
Okay.
That are the most common shame weeds in men's gardens. Now there's lots of them, but these are the most common. Right?
Oh, here.
They feel shame about their lack of sexual experience. These are men now. I'm not talking about children. I'm talking about men. Men will have various degrees of shame about not having enough sexual experience. Men will feel shame about either their masturbatory life or their use of sexual imagery, pornography. Men will feel shame about their body, some dissatisfaction, some aspect of their body that's an enormous source of shame. Men will have a history of maybe a same-sex experience. They'll have too much sexual experience that they're afraid to talk about it. Or they might have a sexual turn-on that really arouses them, that they're afraid to tell anybody. Those are all kind of sexual activation things that people will feel ashamed of. Or also people are afraid of how they function sexually. They're ashamed of how they function sexually. Maybe they have an orgasm too quickly. Maybe they don't have an orgasm, fast enough. Maybe their penis isn't erect or hard enough, or all sorts of things. Or they just don't feel adequate as a partner. They don't feel like they're a tender lover. They're not a good kisser. They smell in areas they don't want to smell. Who knows? But this lack of adequacy as a partner. So those are the 5 general weeds that actually sexual science has said, if you're going to pay attention to sexual shame, see where those 5 weeds land with you. Are they in your garden? And how prolific are they?
I love that, Doug, so much.
Yes.
So how do we
Agreed.
examine, how do we, like, let's say you going through this, I know had stuff go off in all of our heads. Like we're all, oh yeah, that's me, or oh, that experience or whatever. Now, what does it look like to go to look at those weeds that were planted in our garden and examine them and yank them out so that they
this removal
Yes.
is not no. That is
Doug,
way
I
too
just want to
premature.
remove it.
Remember, this is about processing shame. If you remove it too quickly, you won't learn what it has to teach you.
And Doug, you did say something that's important, because it's also, when we're talking about shame, people are like, perfect. If I can just identify it, I can go get it, I can eradicate it, and I can move on. And Doug, you say it slightly different than I do. And I liked your wording is it's not a moment, it's a feeling. And I think I said in last one, it's not like we're going to look for a broken wire. It's in our wiring. I'm not talking brain, but so the going in and finding it and yanking it, that's a moment. You're probably trying to find the shame moment instead of feeling that's a feeling of experience, like anxiety and sadness, and shame is a feeling.
So I plant wildflower seeds in my yard right before California rains. That means seeds grow and you have these new leaves coming out. And I don't know if it's a weed yet or if it's actually one of the flowers I planted. This is happening right now. It's raining in San Diego. I put my seeds in the ground like 3 days ago. So I know I'm going to have to be very careful with these green things that come out of the ground in the next 3 weeks, because I don't know if it's a California bluebell that I can't wait to see or just another weed. So we have to study our garden. We have to be patient. We have to see what's there. And then once we're completely confident it's not what we want, then we have to decide how we're going to approach that particular part of our garden. It's methodical, slow work. It's not impulsive grab and go.
But this process that you're describing is how we move through the shame.
Yes.
Like, you've been sitting in shame for your entire life. This, like, kind of a combination of the garden analogy and the walking over hot coals, like going through the process, is the light at the end of the tunnel. Like that's how we come out of the other side.
Sitting in shame is not the same thing as processing shame.
Can you guys give us like a clinical example of somebody that you've witnessed go process through their shame and come out on the other side?
I can give a general one.
Yeah.
Of the very first thing is for them to start identifying of what that feeling feels like. What you've all done of, this is where I feel in my body, and these are the thoughts that come up, and this is what behaviors I tend to do. I tend to withdraw. They get acquainted with that as an emotion and to start separating from it, and then they start observing where it shows up in their life. And then they start seeing it for what it is, and now they can interact intentionally around it. Is this an old script? Is this old? Because sometimes shame is it can have an age a little bit attached. You all have these formative shame experiences that are stored as your 12-year-old self, and they're like, that's my little self that's guiding me in these adult experiences. How do I want to respond as an adult? And they start giving new scripts and new ways that the 6 principles of sexual health start to orient them of moving through life in a way that moves towards sexual integrity. But the very first thing is, I find the successes, I've not even given room to identify what shame is for me. What is my experience with that? They just feel it, it floods, and they respond to it, and they're just kind of helpless to it, feeling like I am shame.
I used to have my clients fill out a measurement. It was called the Sexual Sentence Completion Scale. And one of my favorite, you'd give a beginning part of a sentence and they'd have to fill in the end. My favorite item on the entire measure, there were 50 questions. My favorite one was, the thing I am most sexually proud of is, and then it was blank. You had to fill in the blank. And more than half of the men who filled out that measure couldn't answer that sentence. They couldn't even write anything. So if you're interested in getting a little measure of your sexual shame, notice all the sexual things you're really proud of about yourself. What you're most proud of yourself sexually. That's a different angle to get at shame, because what you're really sexually proud of, and you can name it and you can say it, that's adding something to your garden that you may not even known was there. Oh my God, that's over in that corner. I never noticed it. I think I want to go over in that corner a little bit. And then go back to these other weeds that are so painful to go to. But I'm glad this other part's in my garden, that I'm really proud of that. I really like that part of myself sexually. It's the best part of me.
How many of you have ever even had an idea or space to think about something you're sexually proud of? I am curious.
Did you, Jake, can you just put some words to that head nod?
Well, I think, we talk about rethinking this, and I think this is one of those things where we don't think along those lines. I think men in particular, but especially men that have very conservative upbringings, sex is not something you're proud of until later on. And then it's usually attached with like children, right? Like I fathered 10 children or these other things.
That's so many children.
And then, I was just thinking about how, for me personally, like when I feel shame, it comes so closely with avoidance. I want to just get out as quick as possible. And so when I hear you talk about a person must process their shame, and then Nate kept referring to sort of like coming out on the other side. And I was thinking of, I don't know if it's as linear as that. I don't think you go in and you process your shame and then you come on the other side. I think once you start to lean in and process your shame, you start to grow yourself to the point where it's not that you've hit the other side. It's just that the stories you've told yourself are no longer holding truth to you, and you no longer value them in the same regard. And so you have this growth or this appearance of coming out on the other side. But in actuality, it's just sort of you've sat and figured out the thing that was kind of holding you back. And then to juxtapose that with the thing I'm proud about, that's a brilliant exercise, because I bet you if you gave 10 of my friends, what are the things you're most sexually ashamed about? And you could write it down, and then you wouldn't have to show it. You could rip it up or burn it or whatever. You're writing like crazy, right? And then you say, okay, flip the page. What's the thing you're most sexually proud of? I know I would sit and go,
bunch of Blake stairs.
And just think about, well, I've never really been asked or thought about taking pride in sexuality that wasn't in a like boastful or sort of like we all know those guys that like brag about their sexuality and their junk and everything, and it feels so hollow to me. It's always felt so hollow. So to have a question about that of like, okay, well, truthfully, what am I most proud of? Honestly, with mine, it would probably be like I overcame a rough start. And the fact that I am moving towards healthy sexuality, that's what I would be proud of initially right now. And I don't think I've ever really thought about that before. It's a fantastic question. And it's an excellent starting point for a person to jump off of, just starting to sort through their garden. And you start to look at those different green shoots that are coming up.
I think the root of this for me that I've grown through this conversation already. I am growing actively, right? You're watching me grow. My garden is growing.
I'm so glad you look happy about that.
I do. I feel really happy. Just the idea of just even having space to be curious is a fascinating concept. And I love that idea of, I'm going to go think about things like, what am I sexually proud of? Or what are those 5 elements that you mentioned, Doug? I loved them about
your most common garden sexual shame weeds.
Yeah. Even just to think about that and to think about where those came from, how I developed them, and then to layer on top of that that it's okay that I feel shame and that I am going to experience that. And if I can maybe even go back to my kids now and have a conversation about, you're going to experience things, and that's totally fine. There's no judgment around that. I want you just to be curious about that and to try to figure out what that's telling you, and then apply that to myself instead of trying to impose on them, hey, don't ever have shame. You don't need to feel shame, that kind of stuff. Just be curious. And when you're curious about it, I would be happy to talk with you about it, or I would love to be able to talk with you about that. It'd be really cool.
Can I add one more skill set to the optimistic work with shame? I think people are more capable of seeing shame if they develop a particular skill set. And that's the ability to hear judgments that other people make.
Yeah.
Because the fuel for shame is judgment, harsh, punitive, demeaning judgments. And we often don't teach children. Did you hear that judgment that person just made? We call them names rather than describe what they're doing. And so I think it's empowering for people to learn, oh, that was a judgmental thing that person just said, which helps somebody make the difference between a shaming interaction and a non-shaming interaction, because the only way to be shamed is to be judged.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people don't see judgments.
This is reminding me, I just listened to Brene Brown's podcast this last week or so. She had a very recent podcast episode that came out, and she was talking about the political divide right now and kind of the polarization of the country. And she said, nothing happens, because she's like the shame expert.
She is.
She's like, nothing. There's never been a big or a small atrocity where one person was cruel to another, whether it's a genocide or just like a family feud, where dehumanization wasn't a part of that experience. And when you mentioned like labeling or calling people names or something like that as a way to create a judgment, oftentimes those labels that we use to make somebody less than human, like separate from ourselves and less than ourselves, so that we feel comfortable judging them. And I've become so conscious after listening to that conversation. I highly recommend it. It's about dehumanization and accountability. But I realized like so much of my life has been filled with me being the person who's doing the dehumanizing. And I think I've also felt dehumanized many times in my life. And it's always associated with the sense of shame. When I'm like, religiously, you can be called inactive, or there are like, are you worthy? Do you have in the Mormon culture, are you like a recommend holder? Are you worthy to go into the temple? Those are all like benchmarks that we use to describe people, and we put them either in the in group or the out group, and there's lots. I'm sure, Doug, you have some thought. You taught us a vague principle, but I'm sure you have some specific examples of ways that we use judgmental language.
Pervert.
A pervert? Okay, perfect.
Yeah, he's a pervert. You're a perv. Or creep. We have lots of judgments about the sexual lives of men in particular.
I remember teaching Sunday school to a group of like 11 and 12-year-olds. And one of the girls said, oh my gosh, he's such a creep. And it was this young man who was probably like just who showed some interest in her, and she didn't like it. And so he was a creep. Yeah.
So here's a sentence I just read in a journal article that was published in 2018, that we are moving into an era where we're compelling men to be more restrained in their sexual expression. And this is a way, for many reasons, where this is important in some ways as well. But one of the consequences of this restraining men in their sexual expression is that it sort of marks male sexuality as somehow more shameful. And so we have to figure out how. That's why the principles of sexual health, I think, are so useful. They're not about restraining sexuality. They're about aligning your sexuality with sexual health rather than constricting your sexuality, which that message can make it seem like if we have to constrict it, I guess if it's unconstricted, it must be really bad. Rather than, sex is supposed to be consensual, non-exploitive, shared values, and the other principles we talked about. So this is the difference between how these principles can sort of guide sexual activity without enforcing a possible consequence of shame.
My brother-in-law has this game he plays with his kids where they'll say, "Oh, Johnny told me this at school today," and he'll say, "Is that a fact or is that an opinion?" It's really fascinating to watch their mind process this. And I kind of want to create a similar game of, is this a judgment or is this an assessment? Or something along those lines of like, well, what is that? And then talk to me about that.
This game would have three options in my mind.
Okay.
Is that a judgment? Is that an opinion? Or is that a feeling? Yeah. Imagine if you asked your kids, is that a judgment? Is that an opinion? Or is you having a feeling?
Yeah. I also think back on, we talk about this. One of the key, I think, things to sort of start to rethink or to overcome some of the shame and these opinions is that you really do have to get to a place where you can start to discuss these things. And we've mentioned these words quite a bit, but for me, this is what I've written down. When I hear about the stories of, Nate in particular and myself when I was growing up, it was a very fear-based system, heavy focus on consequences. And the source of judgment was exteriorly given. It was by an outside source. And I think one of the key things for me personally, so that's an offering for anyone who wants to take it, but it's not a guarantee this is going to work, is to sort of shift your mindset into a place of curiosity, seeking understanding. So instead of coming at it from a place of fear, so when you talk about someone on the little screen earlier pulled up that said, being labeled a sex addict is dehumanizing as well. I think one of those things is, there we go. Porn addict feels dehumanizing as well. Can you sit there and rather go from a fear and consequence place of, okay, I'm a porn addict, which means I'll probably lose my wife, which means I'll probably lose my kids, et cetera, and you feel yourself tense and you're holding on to this. It's to looking at it and going, okay, curiosity, why do I do this? Why is that shoot coming out of my garden? What caused it? Why do I still have it there? Do you have a safe space where you can vocalize this outside of just your head or your journal or whatever? Do you have a friend or a guy before you go to your wife to try these things on, to sort of get comfortable saying these words and to be seeking understanding for it? I think that is something that could be so powerful for a person who's kind of just mired in this shame rut, to start to change their perception around it before they have to go out and explain or continue to process with those outside of themselves.
Jake, you brought up something as you were talking that made me curious, because when we're looking at our gardens of sexuality, and you were sitting there being like, where is this shoot? Why is it there? It makes me also, in the spirit of shame, we might have things in our garden that we really like, but someone else says, well, that's an ugly plant. Why do you still have that in there? Get rid of it.
Why do you have a cactus in your garden?
Why do you have that?
And notice the look on people's faces when they do that. It's like, it's like you can't even say that thing without your face.
I also think that we're looking at shame in our garden, taking the pause of, okay, I will be right back.
Okay.
I'll continue Chris's thought, because I have been dealing with that myself as I've been sitting here, and specifically related to porn or sexual imagery. I've been thinking to myself, can I say to myself, and can I say out loud, I enjoy sexual imagery, or I enjoy porn? I feel...
Well, wait a minute. You just said it. How was that?
I did just say it. The feeling that I had even thinking about saying that was like, whoa, I don't think I can. Yeah, can I say that? Can I feel that? I felt a very emotional, I had a very deep feeling about just saying that. And the idea of being able to just explore that and be curious and express that to anybody, myself or somebody else, is incredibly daunting. But I think is that where we're going with let's be curious enough to be able to say that and experience that shame and then try to process and move through that shame.
Not to go into the weeds with the metaphor. What comes up for me is in the spirit of eradicating our sexual garden. If we're in this place of conflict where it's like, get rid of the porn, get rid of the masturbation, is there hasn't even been space of, well, do I want that? Like,
right.
So if you chop off just the top of a weed, it appears to be gone, but it's still there. Yeah. And so I guess when Doug was saying, earlier when you're saying just go pull it out, there may be a moment that this getting acquainted with our sexual garden and shame of giving ourselves space for the first time to be like, maybe I want it in there. I haven't even been able to ask myself if I want it in there. I just always assume I don't want it in there because everyone tells me it's a bad thing in my garden.
Right.
And so I go in and I mow down the weeds because I feel kind of ambivalent around it, actually. I don't know if I want it. I don't know if I do, and I don't know if I don't. I just haven't had time or space.
I think, Kristen, I want to follow up on what you said, because Hans, you just did something I see people do all the time. And this is about another way to think about processing shame. You move a little bit through it, and then you have to stop and look around and ask somebody, is this okay? Am I doing the right thing? That's the way it works. It's not a one-way street. You just go through it by yourself. You're going to go a little bit through it, and you're going to stop and you say, is this what it is? Am I doing it right? That's so human. So I just wanted to really acknowledge your stopping and being vulnerable and saying, is that what this is? That's a really important question to ask as a skill for processing shame.
Thanks, Doug.
I also want to point out, Kristen and Hans, the way that you guys just talked about this was beautiful, because I don't think my sexual garden, I don't think I really took responsibility for my sexual garden until I stopped looking just at the weeds, but also looked at all the other things that were planted there that I thought I wanted. And sometimes the beliefs that I had that meant the most to me and I felt were most pure and good, the way that I lived those beliefs were actually causing me more damage than the weeds themselves that were planted there. Does that make sense? Like examining for just an example, about pornography, instead of saying like, I need to just cut out the weed of pornography out of my life, I can step back and say, this plant that I've cultivated about pornography in my life and the judgments that I have about it and the feelings that I have about it, is that serving me? Like, what has it helped me to believe this story about pornography, or has it hurt me? Has it made me a better person and helped me connect with other people, or has it made me withdraw from people? Has it made me, I still, like, to this day, I'm not personally, I'm not like, yes, sign me up. I want pornography to play a major role in my life. But also, I don't want to talk about pornography in a way that makes me want to like run and hide every time it pops up in my life. I don't want pornography, the dialogue around it and the thoughts and the emotions around it to be constant shame and disappointment and betrayal. And so it's like, how can I maybe hold on to the core belief of pornography isn't something that I want to cultivate in my life, but also the way that we talk about it isn't like, let's pour napalm on it and destroy it, but like, let's get curious about it and see if the way that we talk about it and the beliefs we've nurtured are maybe giving pornography more space to grow unintentionally, if that makes sense. I don't know if what I'm saying is clear or not, but when I started examining the beliefs that I held most dear, is also that was a part of the process of kind of taking ownership of my garden. That's it.
I think two things that came up for me. I think one that helped me in my process was at some point in time, I had to take ownership over judgment. For so long, that judgment had come from an exterior source. And in order for me to me to move through my shame and to process it, I had to take ownership and start to rely on my judgment. The other thing that came up was, I don't think anyone wants a garden that's just full of pornography, let's say. But I think what kind of occurs is that you spend so much time trying to minimize or hide or not let that take over the garden that the rest of your garden just dies naturally because you're spending so much time, energy, and focus managing that one small aspect of your garden. I think if we went to a garden that was all sexual imagery or all pornography or whatever it is, it'd be like, ugh. Like no one likes it. I mean, gardens are beautiful because of the variety, right? So the same thing with that of like, I think a lot of times when we don't realize when we're putting all this effort into hiding or moving or adjusting or constantly that we're neglecting the rest of the garden and it is wilting and withering. And so we need to pull up. Now, I think that's a lot of times we feel so bad. It's because we've just been blinders on that one aspect of our lives and our sexuality and our gardens. And so it's important to pull back up and be like, I don't need to necessarily eradicate this right now, but I'm going to tend to these other areas. And then I'll come back here and I'll just, like, once I've got my garden balanced, then when I come back, now what am I feeling towards this particular variety?
Yes.
Okay.
We've hit our time. That's an hour of sexual health conversations, guys. I love this topic. I think we could do like 2 more episodes on this. This was so much fun.
This was great.
Thank you guys for showing up and for sharing. I hope that those who are watching, that this was like, if we were talking about what shame is and how it feels in the last conversation, this is how it gets processed. I think we gave some really great examples and context for people to help move through their shame. And I really appreciate you guys for having this conversation. I needed it. We'll be having another conversation soon. If you want more information, go to rethinkingpornaddiction.com. You can find links to the YouTube channel, the Facebook group, and now the podcast. Thanks to Hans.
Called The Sexual Health Show. Rethinking Porn Addiction.
Awesome.
Okay, guys, we'll see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.